In this video tutorial, I'm going to be going over the architecture of the React Starter Kit, which is an open source project for an open source universal React Redux GraphQL boilerplate. Now in this video tutorial, I'm going to be going over the various different parts of the project, the files, the source code. I'm going to be showing you how things, where things are and how things are built. However, before we get into that, I'd just like to encourage you to visit our official GitHub repository and support us by starring our project. I also recommend forking the project, which basically means that it will clone the project to your personal GitHub account, which means that you're going to be able to commit code as you develop the project and obviously use those versioning tools that everybody loves GitHub for. I'd also like to say that if you'd like more of an introduction to this starter kit, then I'm going to include another link in the description of this video to the first video of this series, which is an introduction to the starter kit, and we explain what this is and how it can be used in a lot greater detail. As I said, today I'm going to be jumping straight into the code as quick as possible and just showing you the actual architecture of the project. Another comment is that this project is an ongoing ongoing, and of course this is an ongoing video series, which means that of course we're going to be releasing a great deal of content. Now if you actually come to our GitHub page, we've written a huge amount of documentation, but what we really want to do is supply that in video format. So now in future videos we're going to cover a lot more specific areas. So for example, we'll create very short videos on creating pages, how to use carousels, how to set up routing, etc. These are all things that we want to create specific videos for. But if there's any specific content that you feel would be more beneficial, that you would like us to cover sooner than later, then please use social media. Contact us on Facebook, contact us on YouTube, on GitHub, etc. Contact us, let us know what content you want us to cover first, and of course we will pay attention to you guys. So I've gone ahead and I've cloned the repository to my local machine, and I'm running this on port 3000. I've also opened up our project folder in my chosen text editor, which is VS Code. Now the first file I want to introduce you to is the package JSON file. Now of course here this is where we reference all of our dependencies, and you can also see the versions of those that we're using. The other things I just want to shout out here is that of course this is provided to you under an MIT license. We also have a list of predefined scripts that you can use whenever you want. The most important ones of course would be the build, which obviously runs a build of your project. We also have dev. This is used whenever you want to run your project locally on a development environment. Basically just creates a watch of your files so that whenever it detects a change, whenever you save a file, it's going to recompile your code so you can refresh your browser and see the change in front of you. We've also included an additional script here, which is for the Heroku post build. Now this is a script that if you deploy your code to Heroku, every time that you push your code, it's going to by default, it's going to install your dependencies, and then it's going to check for this script. And we are running a build command. So it's actually going to build your code, build your project on the server every time that you deploy it, which is really, really useful because if you check your git ignore file, it's really good practice that you should never commit your build to your project in the same way that you shouldn't commit your node modules. So I'm just going to close these files and move on. The next file I want to talk to you about is the web config JSON file. Now you can add to this as you develop your project and your website, but the most important thing here is the site URL. Now this is really for asset management when it comes to images and even your bundles. We use absolute URLs. So what does that mean? If we actually come over to the browser, and I'm just going to look at this image here, I'm going to right click and inspect element, and what you're going to see is that we are referencing a full HTTP address to this file. Now this is because we're using this site URL to prefix all of the assets and files that we reference in the project. This is really important because there's a lot of ways to reference assets within a React application. One of the most common ways is probably to require an image within a given component and then reference that in your HTML. The issue is really when you get to more complex routing, you might find that you end up with some broken URLs. The easiest way around this is to just use absolute paths from the start. Now we are also going to do this with our bundles. So for example, if I view page source, we're referencing a client bundle here, and this is also using that same site URL to prefix the path to that bundle. Now this is really important. So as you can understand, whenever you want to run this on your local development environment and whenever you want to push this up and deploy it, this needs to be configured. So obviously whenever you're running this on dev and your local host, you need to make sure that you update this file to point to your localhost 3000. And before you deploy it, you need to make sure that you update this to reference your remote URL, your domain name, which would be the full HTTP address. So HTTP or HTTPS google.com, for example, or mydomain.com, for example, and make sure that you never ever leave a trailing slash. This should just be your domain name .com or 3000. I'm going to come back to this file a little bit later, but of course, as I said, you can add to this as much as you wish. Now, of course, we also are using Webpack to run, build, and compile our code. You're going to notice straight away that we have two Webpack files. We have one for the client and one for the server. Now, as you can imagine, if we look at the build folder, we have two bundles. We have one for the server and we have one for the client. Now, there are a few differences between these two files. I need to explain about this, but I want to come back to this because I don't want to risk maybe confusing people with why we build this or configure this in this way at this point. I think it'll be a lot easier to explain coming back to this a little bit later. So I'm just going to leave this alone for now, but feel free to look at these files and kind of maybe get some ideas yourself, especially if you are familiar with Webpack already. Now we also have a source folder here. SRC stands for source. And I just want to go over the code here. So the first thing that you're going to find is we have an assets folder. If I expand that, it's quite self-explanatory. We have a graphics folder, and this obviously contains all of our image assets. If we look at our build, that folder is literally copied over into our build. So it's literally copied. If we look at the next folder, we have an SCSS folder. This is, of course, we are using Sass. So Sass is a preprocessor for CSS. It allows us to write more clean, functional CSS. So for example, if we look at a config CSS partial file, we've got a few mix-ins. We're also defining some colors that we can reference throughout the style sheets. Now again, this is not a tutorial for Sass, but it's something that I fully recommend you to consider using if you're not already familiar with Sass and preprocessors. And again, of course, assuming that you are familiar, because of course this is kind of a lot more standard now in the industry. I'm just going to assume that you are familiar with this, and if not, then just recommend that you go away and learn more about it. Now for this, we've basically broken this up into different parts. So we have a base, and this is for things like forms and our default CSS, where we just specify some default styling for the project. We can overwrite this in more specific files, but this is just a great way of creating some reusable classes and just specifying some browser resets in the same way that you would use normalize. We also then have a folder for components. Generally, this is for components that are not connected to state or the store, but you can imagine it's basically for our header and for the footer, things like that. We then have a pages folder, and we have created a separate partial file for each of our pages. And also this kind of replicates the structure of our components when I show you that in just a second. Now, if you are familiar with this, then you're going to know that in our styles SCSS file, we're just including all of those partial files. So whenever you actually compile this code, if we look at our client bundle and what we come here, we'll see that we're looking for all the SCSS files. So that wouldn't include partial files. So when this actually compiles your SCSS, Webpack is going to ignore all of your partial files. So the only file that Webpack is going to look at is going to be this styles SCSS file. If you start looking at performance and trying to optimize performance for the web, you want to reduce the number of HTTP calls as much as possible. So just in development, it's very nice to have kind of very modular code, so broken up into components, for example. It's one of the great things about React. In the same way, for CSS, it's very useful to have our CSS broken up into these kind of partial files. So we have a file for posts, a file for our about page, a file for our home page. It's quite easy to work with. But then Sass allows us to compile all of that code together into one file, which obviously is going to result when it's compiled. If we go into our build folder, into assets, we have a CSS folder, which contains our CSS. We have a single CSS file, which is also minified, which means that it removes all the spaces, etc. We have this one file here, which houses all of our code. So it's really, really useful. And that's how the SCSS works in this project. Another really important part of this is actually for image URLs. What you'll notice here, if we do a little search here for background image, what you'll notice is that sometimes you're going to want to reference an image or an asset in your CSS. What you need to do is actually just specify the path from assets. And if you actually look at the Webpack configuration, if we go over to client, we actually specify when we compile the code a root URL. And again, we're importing that from the web config file, that JSON file here. So even in our CSS, we're actually using site URL. So if you look at the style sheet when it's compiled, if we come back over to our style sheet and we do a search for HTTP, you're going to see that we have that full HTTP address in our CSS. So that's really, really important to understand that you can do that as well. Now we also have email templates, which is the next folder that you're going to see here. And of course in here, this is the email templates that we're using. Now by default, as I said, we have implemented Redux form. We've also shown you how to use Node Mailer, which is a way of processing to actually send an email with Node. It's a really, really easy thing to do. So actually, just to show you, if I come to client and I go to pages and I go to the contact page, what you'll see here is, of course, we have a form which is created and built here. But in the submit method, we're doing a post to send mail, okay? And we're passing through the data that Redux comes from Redux form in the body of that post. Now, if we come over to that server file, I told you we have two routes. That second route, the first one handles the normal routing on our application, but our second route, it isn't actually a route. It's for the post, if there's a post to send mail. Okay, and in that instance, we are using Node Mailer, which you can configure yourself. Just enter in your credentials to a Gmail account, or if you have your own mail server, then you can configure that here. You can go to the documentation for Node Mailer. Very simple and easy to do. And in here, we're just basically configuring our email. And again, please just reference the documentation for Node Mailer. It's very simple to do. But I'm actually showing you here how you can use your own custom email templates. And you can set this up for as many forms as you like. Now, while we're actually looking at this form, I think it would be a good time to just cover a few things with that. If we actually come over to that component for that form, which is contact page, as I mentioned, we are using Redux form. And if I just come down, you're going to notice that we have, first of all, we've built up a fairly decent chunk of HTML. So if I open up, for example, the SCSS file in base, which is forms CSS, one of the things that I did mention here was that we have a lot of reusable classes. And not just for classes, we have some default styling for even just elements like input, select, and text area. It's not just going to be the ugly styling that just comes by default with Google Chrome or whatever browser. We have some default overrides that just kind of prettify everything. But we also have some really useful classes and CSS for forms. So for example, here we have a form wrap, form row, etc. And if you come over to the contact page in your browser, you're going to see that it has some default styling, which isn't too bad. It looks pretty nice. But we also have some common components, some reusable code. So one of those is for form fields. So if we come over into client and we go into our common folder, you're going to notice that we have a forms folder, an input, and in here we have two other folders. One is for input types and one is for validation. So if we go into input types and we have this index.js file, we're exporting two constants. The first one is to render a text field, and the second is to render a text area. Okay. Now inside here we have some code that does various things, and of course you can look at this yourself at a later time. One of the most important things is we're using class names, which is a great module that allows you to easily set up class names that is kind of connected to your state for touched and error classes, which are really important. But if we come over to our contact page, we're actually importing those two constants, which are our input types, and where we're using this field component, we're specifying that input type component, and then we're passing through some props. So for example, we're passing through the label, and if you look in the this constant that we're exporting, this input type, if you come over to here, we're capturing that as props and we're passing it through into that component. And of course down here we also have some validation. So if we go into the validation, we have created a constant for this particular form. So we have validate contact form, and then of course we're just specifying some validation, and then in our contact page we're importing that constant as validate, which is very important. We need to always import this as validate. And down here where we're connecting our component with Redux form, we're passing through validate. so that when we're actually looking at this in our browser, we specify that this cannot be null. If I click send, it doesn't actually allow this to submit because it's required. If this has a value, so example, and I submit, you're going to see that there is no error here. So it's really important to understand, we have implemented a lot of the functionality, the more advanced functionality like Redux form, etc., that you may be looking to do in your own applications. And even if you want to, build it slightly differently, maybe you don't want a contact form, maybe you want a booking form or something like that, you can use this as a base to go forward and build your own, whatever it is that you're trying to build. You can use this as a great starting point. Now, while we're on the subject of components and pages, let's actually use this as a springboard to go into some of our components and our client folder. So let's collapse our assets folder and let's open up our client folder here. And in here we have all the code for our app. Okay, so the most important one here probably is pages. And inside here we have all the components for our pages, so about page, that contact page we just looked at, etc. Now, if you look at a file like this, let's say this is our about page. It's fairly basic. Okay, all of the code for this component lives in this file. Everything is kind of hard coded. But let's go over to some more advanced pages. So, for example, let's go to the blog page. Now, as you can imagine, this page is a lot more complicated. It actually needs to go and fetch data before it actually renders anything. Okay, so for example, this content, these blog posts, these don't live within the component. This code is actually stored somewhere else. It's on a server somewhere in a CMS. Okay, so this component, it needs to go out and fetch that data before it throws anything down to the client. And the reason is because of server-side rendering. Okay, so if you actually view page source on this page, all that content is rendered by the server. Now this is really, really important because if you look at search engine optimization, if you look at Google, for example, when they crawl your website, they need to actually, when they come and look at your website, this is what it wants to see. It wants to see this content. And then it will, look at this text, and it will look at this text, and it will say, hey, what's the keyword density? What is this? Try and figure out what this page is about. If, let's say, cats as a keyword is used 20 times, it's probably going to know this page has got something to do with cats. So the problem is that if this wasn't server-side rendered, if this content didn't exist here, it wasn't thrown down by the server, then Google wouldn't wait for the client bundle to initialize to go out and fetch and populate the div with that content. That's server-side rendering, and I'm sure everybody knows what it is. But how does it work within our project? So let's look at that page. Let's go to the blogs folder and let's look at that posts component. And as you can see, it's actually there's not too much code in this component, but what we do is more advanced. So what we do is, now by default, when you create a component, so let's actually look at that about page. We are effectively just exporting that component, right? So you create a class as you do here, right, with the name of posts. And then what you're used to doing is something like this. You say export default, the name of the class, and that's it, right? So that's probably what you're used to seeing. But what we're doing is a little bit different. We're actually exporting an object. And that object contains two things. It contains a load data function, and it contains a component. Okay? So what is load data? Load data is actually going to enable us to go out and fetch the data, go out and make any asynchronous calls that we need to make, and then it's going to allow us to render the component. So this load data function is actually used on the server. And inside here, we're simply just dispatching whatever action that we need to dispatch before we can render the page. So for example, fetch posts. And we're exporting that with our component. So let's see how this is used by the server. So let's come back to our server file. This is our node file. And let's look at our route here. So this is our route. This handles our routing, sorry. And as you can see, the first thing that we're doing here is we're passing through an array as our first argument. Now, that's not too important at this time. What is important is to understand that we're checking for this load data function. And actually what we're doing is we're basically waiting for a number of promises to be resolved. What that means is that it's going to wait until all of those calls are complete before it throws down that initial HTML. And what actually happens is it's going to compile all of that code from the component. It's then going to come here to helpers and render.js. In this file, we have a template. And it's basically going to throw down that content and populate it inside here. This is our content. Okay, inside this div here with the ID of root. And that's really, really important. Because if we come through and we actually look at that page again, so our post page, all we're doing here is we're basically dispatching an action. Now again, if you're familiar with Redux, we have an actions file up here. And again, this isn't about, this isn't a tutorial on Redux. It's simply showing you the architecture. We may do more tutorials further down the line that actually shows you how Redux works, etc. But at this point, we're just covering the architecture. So this is the action that we're dispatching. And what we're actually doing is we're using GraphQL. It's a GraphQL CMS. So we've created a query. And again, this isn't a tutorial on GraphQL. We are posting to an API, and then we're getting a response. And then we are actually dispatching our action here to actually update our store. And we're just giving it a payload of the data that we received as a response. Now you may wonder here why we're posting and not doing a GET request. And that's actually because we are using GraphQL. Now again, you may not be familiar with GraphQL. It is a query-side, a client-side query language. It allows you to, it's a really, really great modern tool used a lot in single-page applications, in React applications, and the idea is that it's replacing REST APIs in single-page applications. It prevents over and under fetching because it allows you to submit a query as part of your post request and basically specify the data that you want returned. So, for example, I'm actually saying I want post title, the short description, slug, image URL. These are the fields that I'm going to use. I don't want any more information from this API. So it is a really, really efficient way of using, of handling data in your application. And because we're using Redux, our implementation of GraphQL is slightly different. So for example, in GraphQL, the standard implementation is to actually use something called Apollo. However, GraphQL can actually be used normally. An API, a GraphQL API, can be queried with a normal HTTP request. And as you can see here, we're just submitting a query as part of the body of our post, then we're getting that response. So what's happening here is we're dispatching another action to our reducer, which is over in our reducers folder. And as you can see, we have a posts reducer, and basically it's just we're using a switch function, and basically we're just supplying different cases, and for fetch posts, which is what we're submitting here when we're dispatching that action, and we're just simply appending that payload to our store. Now that's a fairly detailed overview of how this works, and actually more information about the implementation of Redux and GraphQL, which is really, really great. But the one thing that I just want to explain before I move on to something else is you may wonder why here we are actually making two calls. We're actually dispatching this fetch posts action twice. If we come down and we look at the load data function, this is used by the server. We would be dispatching this action once, which would make one API call. And then over here on component did mount, we are dispatching that action again, which would make a second API call. So the reason why we are doing this is actually because of client-side routing. So when we actually navigate, there are two ways of navigating our application. The first is when we actually just click through, right? So if I'm in our application within the web browser, and I click through on the navigation, and I go and I browse to different pages, this is actually client-side routing. The routing has been handled by the client. However, if I put something in here, or I have a direct URL, or if I manually type in the URL and I click return, then that is going to load it on the browser. It's going to load it on the server. Now the problem is, if I was to only dispatch these actions within this load data function on the server, whenever I browse the site with client-side routing, so for example, if I'm just clicking through these links, this load data function wouldn't be called. It wouldn't dispatch this action. So for client-side routing, we also need to dispatch it on the client, which is why we're doing it here. Now we have talked a little bit about routing already, but I haven't actually covered it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So if we expand our clients folder, we have a routes.js file. So if we just open up our routes.js file, what you'll see is we actually have all of our routes defined here. Now the reason that we've specified this as an array of objects rather than using what you may be more familiar with, which is the more component-based style of defining your routes, is because it's to do with server-side rendering. So we actually have to use something called a static router, because our routes need to be run both on the client and on the server. Now, the way that it works is we create this array of objects, and each object contains a path, a layout component, and a routes array. Okay, and basically, if we look at our helpers and render.js, we are defining the static router here. And then if we come over to the client and client.js, we're using the more standard browser router. And of course, we are rendering our routes within each one of these two routers. Now, what we need to do is pass through that array of routes, which we're defining here as an array of objects. And it's very, very simple to use, and actually I find it a lot simpler and a lot nicer, to be honest. I really do prefer it. The way that it works is for each page, for example, services or about, you create a new object. You can specify a layout for any one of those pages. So for example, if we look at app.js, so here I'm importing all of these components, these pages, these files. We have app.js, and this file can be viewed as your master layout. So basically the way that this works is I define the header and the footer, and then in between those two I'm rendering my routes. Now when I actually define this here, I then have a routes array where I'm specifying the component that's going to be loaded into that layout. So as I said, in the app.js file, I'm rendering my routes here, and what I would be rendering there in this case is services or about, etc. Now the beauty of this is that you can actually create as many layouts as you like. So you also have a layouts folder here, and you can create a custom layout. You can create as many as you like. And in this example, it's actually exactly the same. But you can change this as much as you like. And then all you need to do is in your routes file, rather than specifying app, you'd specify that custom layout that you've exported and you've imported into this file. The only one that's slightly different is for the blog, and that's because we're specifying an ID here, which is actually just going to capture the parameter and pass that through as props. So what that means is if we look at that in the web browser, if we go over to blog and we're looking at these posts, if I click on one of them, this is the slug. So it's actually going to that path, so blog, as you can see here, and then it's capturing an ID, which is here, and it's passing that through as props, which is then used to make the call to the server to actually go and collect the data for this to be returned in the client. Now, one of the things that I wanted to come back to at the end of this video was the reason why we have a client bundle and a server bundle, and why we have two separate Webpack files. Now, one of the most obvious differences between these two files, if we come over to the server Webpack file, we are telling Webpack to ignore all the libraries, all of our node modules, because we don't need it on the server. Now, one of the biggest impacts that makes is actually the file size. So if we look at the bundle.js file and we come down to the bottom, you'll notice this has about 3,000 lines. And if we come over to the client bundle, it has well over 5,000, because we're simply not including any of those libraries because we don't need them on the server. But that isn't the only difference. Some of the other differences would include the fact that if you have any private keys or anything like that that you don't want to be included in the client bundle, then this will be only included in the bundle, which is run on the server, and you can restrict access to it within your node file. But that isn't the real reason that we have configured it in this way, because the most important thing is actually to do with server-side rendering. The way that this works, as I mentioned before, is that we are exporting a load data function, which basically includes a bunch of promises which need to be resolved before we throw down the initial HTML from the server. Now, the way that this works is that whenever we throw down that initial HTML from the server, the actual React and JavaScript functionality is disabled because all we have at that point is HTML. Now, if we inspect this and view page source, as I've mentioned a few times, we are including the client bundle at the very bottom of this file. So whenever we throw down the initial HTML from the server, and this is rendered in the browser, it eventually hits the client bundle. And when this client bundle is initiated, it immediately triggers all of our React functionality is then initiated on the page, and client-side routing, things like that, takes over. Now, another thing that I would really like to encourage you to do is visit our official Facebook page. There will be a link in the description of this video. Obviously, here we release whenever we release new content, we will be posting about it here. So if you follow us, if you like us on Facebook, it's a great way to stay updated when we do release new content, etc. going forward. Of course, we'll also include a link to our website, which is simpletat.com. And obviously here we will you can actually browse our entire library of tutorials. And our official website, which is siteeasy.com, which is where we provide pre-built solutions and scripts for your business needs. And of course, if you visit our repository for the React Starter Kit, you can click through to our official project website, which is reactstarterkit.com. And you can actually use this to click through to a demo where you can actually see the code working which has been deployed to Heroku. And of course, we have a link here that just takes you directly back to our GitHub repository and project page. Once again, thank you very much, and I look forward to providing more content in the near future.